All right, good morning. And thank you all for joining today's Foreign Policy Institute coffee hour entitled From Climate Change to COVID-19, Subnational Diplomacy in the Age of Trump. I'm Carla Freeman, and I direct the Foreign Policy Institute at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. And I have the pleasure of moderating today's discussion with FPI Fellow Tiffany Basciano, whom I'll introduce momentarily. I'm delighted Tiffany has given us this important and very timely topic to focus on in our discussion today. Before I introduce her and we get started, let me just make a few technical notes. We're going to begin the program with 20 or 30 minutes of remarks from our speaker, and then we'll turn right over to the Q&A, although I may get it going with a few questions of my own. But we should have at least a half an hour, maybe a bit more for questions. I just want to remind you that the discussion is being recorded and we will post it on the Foreign Policy Institute's YouTube page. So with that in mind, if you would, please be conscious of your movements within your camera frame, and I'm a really bad example because I tend to move around a lot. Also keep your mic on mute, if you would, until you're called on to ask a question during the Q&A portion. And the way that we can do that is if you would use the raise hand function, and that way I'll call on you by name, and I think everybody's names are appearing for me, so I'll be able to address you by your name. If you can't make the raise hand function work, then please do use the chat function, but just include your name in that so I can identify you and ask you to ask your question. So it's a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker today. Tiffany Basciano is a non-resident fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute and a longtime colleague of mine at SAIS. For almost 10 years, she served as the Associate Director of the International Law and Organizations Program here at SAIS. And during that time, she did an incredible job of expanding activities, as well as founding and managing a very popular experiential learning course in international human rights. And I've personally learned a great deal from Tiffany as I've delved into international relations topics involving China on international law and organizations. So it's great to have a chance to hear from her about her latest work. Tiffany is a first-generation college graduate. She received her bachelor's cum laude in politics and history from New York University, and her JD with honors as well from the George Washington University Law School, a school that's been in the news recently. Her professional interests include the rule of law, global policy, and today's topic, city diplomacy. Tiffany's speaking to us not from Washington, D.C., but from the New York area, where she's spending time with her family, especially getting to know, I just saw pictures, her latest addition, a really beautiful, adorable 4-month-old baby named Elodie, but she's looking ahead to new challenges and opportunities where she'll be able to apply her skills, knowledge, and her energy, and I'm excited to see what she's going to do next. But Tiffany, thank you for joining us. And again, bringing us a really important but under-considered dimension or layer of the international relations of the current pandemic, as well as other transnational global issues. So over to you.
Thank you, Carla. That was a very kind introduction. I appreciate it. And I just want to thank Danny and Stephanie, who I don't think's on the line as well, for hosting this webinar and making it all happen. And I'd be remiss if I didn't thank the participants for joining us today. I see a number of our former students and SAIS colleagues have come on today, and I greatly appreciate it. And I hope you find this webinar informative. And I hope it sparks your curiosity to dive deeper into city diplomacy. Today, you'll hear me use the word subnational diplomacy. So it, broad strokes, so it can include states in the US. So I'll try to use subnational diplomacy when I'm talking broadly. If I'm just talking about city diplomacy, I'll hone in on that. So with that, I'm going to get started with a little anecdote. which some of you might be familiar with. The governor of Maryland, Larry Hogan, a couple of months ago negotiated with South Korea for a deal for 500,000 COVID test kits. He went to discuss this deal on The Daily Show with Trevor Noah, which is a great source of sanity for me during these times. And while he's discussing the deal, Governor Hogan observed that he had no choice because of the insufficient federal response. And he also acknowledged how unusual it was to have a deal like this because states don't normally engage in international deals. And he's not wrong. It's unusual, but it was out of necessity that he had to do it. So I think this anecdote illustrates a number of things, including the complete failure of the Trump administration to respond to the pandemic. But it also illustrates where subnational diplomacy can come into play and be useful. What I want to focus on today is threefold. I'd like to focus first on the space created for subnational diplomacy by these national failures to address global challenges. Second, I'd like to discuss the significance of local leaders in filling that void. Sometimes they're filling the void, other times they're being very proactive and engaging in what might be seen as the sole prerogative of nation states. And finally, I want to look at what all this subnational activity means for the international system currently and the future of global governance. I want to expand on these ideas with some case studies, manifestations of subnational diplomacy, first in the context of climate change, because it's way more developed and robust. And then I'll turn to COVID-19, which I'm sure you haven't heard enough about already, but this puts it in a little bit of a different light. So first with climate change, subnational diplomacy in the climate change context is not new. And it's not surprising why it's taken off there, especially in cities. That's because climate change disproportionately impacts cities. Cities are on coastlines, they are economic powerhouses, they are growing in population, and cities are bearing the brunt of the climate change impacts. And so given their proximity to their residents, they have to respond. You know, I accidentally trick-or-treated on our former mayor's house this past October. You know, that's the local connections where you can knock on your mayor's door and say, hey, we've got a problem here. And so local actors are responsive to their constituents in ways that national actors are not. And I know there's still some debate that I don't quite understand in the US about whether climate change is real. It's real, and I think many US residents know it's real because they've been experiencing it with Hurricane Sandy and Hurricane Florence and others. And so I think they recognize that climate change isn't just a high-level discussion taking place in Geneva or Vienna, but it's something that comes into their own backyards. So when we look back at 2017, which seems like forever ago, and look back at Trump's announcement to withdraw from the Paris Climate Change Agreement, it's also not surprising that his announcement ignited a flurry of activity among US states and cities to save the US commitments to Paris. I think it also illustrates just how out of touch Trump is from his rhetoric to what's actually going on the ground. During that announcement, Trump famously said, he represents Pittsburgh, not Paris. The mayor of Pittsburgh had a very different idea and approach to that, and he responded that he pledges his support to the Paris guidelines. So cities very much know what's at stake here. And that puts them at odds with US foreign policy, which is a very interesting position for a nation state to be in. Just a few other examples in the climate change context that I think will illustrate different modes that subnational entities are using. The first is something called the Chicago Climate Charter. It was established late in 2017. It's billed as a first of its kind non-binding international charter. This charter has mayors from around the United States and the world signed up to achieve goals that are even more ambitious than the Paris guidelines. Now, this, to me as an international lawyer, looks a lot like treaty making, but I also know that the Constitution prohibits states from engaged in treaty making. So it looks like treaty making, but it's not, because the State Department views treaty making as legally binding, and this is a non-binding charter. But it could transcend that. Just because states and cities can't formally make international law, they can influence rulemaking and norm making, and something could develop into some soft transnational norm making. So that's one example where you see cities behaving like nation states. Another way that cities have carved a space for themselves is at the multilateral level, and particularly at the UN under the framework of the Sustainable Development Goals. In 2019, New York City pioneered a voluntary local review, also known as a VLR. This review reports the city's progress to the UN on the Sustainable Development Goals, which also includes climate change. And this behavior mirrors that of what nation states are supposed to do under the SDGs, which is a voluntary national review, or VNR. New York City's approach was very successful, and other cities around the world have adopted this approach. So we here see an example of cities making a space for themselves within a multilateral institution that doesn't really have a mechanism for them. The final example I want to give in the climate change context is an example of a city taking over what used to be a State Department initiative. A few years ago, the Trump State Department failed to support what would be the third annual US-China Climate Leaders Summit. This was an initiative started by Obama, so it's not surprising that they failed to support it moving further. It was scheduled to take place in Boston, and the mayor of Boston, Mayor Walsh, wanted to see it happen, thought it was important, and he saved the summit by rebranding it from a bilateral summit, I think because he saw the foreign policy implications of a city hosting a bilateral summit, and he rebranded it to an International Mayors Climate Summit. So this is an example of a mayor stepping up when the federal government steps out of what it would have been its traditional role. So these are just a handful of examples where subnational actors are asserting themselves in global climate governance. There are many other examples, particularly given how broad the climate change network is, and city diplomacy is well evolved, and there's a number of different networks. With that, I'm going to move on to the issue of the year, the reason why 2020 has been awful, COVID. So the COVID issue in the subnational context in the US has largely been about scrambling for PPE, which I'm sure at this point everybody knows is the personal protective equipment. The federal response just created chaos. There was no real international response from the WHO in terms of coordinating protective equipment. So we have a number of different examples, such as the one I illustrated with Governor Hogan. Just to go a little bit more detail, he was able to leverage the First Lady of Maryland, who is from South Korea, and her connections to procure the supplies. So it's a lot of it has to do with the First Lady and maybe not Larry Hogan as much, but he gave adequate thanks to her. So we have a similar example with the governor of Massachusetts, Charlie Baker, who was able to procure 1,095,000 masks from a Chinese manufacturer. Because it was not a natural function of being the governor of Massachusetts, he had to scour around the Boston area to find connections to help make this happen. And much like Governor Hogan, he had no choice. He had no choice given all the chaos surrounding the PPE bidding, the federal seizures of PPE orders from local governments, and this chaos bred the necessity for subnational diplomacy. Now, there are even smaller, more quaint acts that might be more familiar. I'm sure everybody's familiar with the Sister Cities program. So in Gilbert, Arizona, it's Sister City. In China, I believe it's Luhan, China. They sent over 195 masks. So we have these, these smaller examples of international cooperation. The final COVID example I want to talk about will also be familiar in the climate change context. It's that of C40. C40, for those who don't know, is an international network of cities, and they've been really focused on climate change and information sharing and have been doing a great job in that context. But I want to discuss what they're doing in relation to COVID. So in relation to COVID, in late March, the mayor of Los Angeles, who also happens to be the current chair of C40, hosted a video call with mayors from all around the world to share their experiences with responding to COVID. So they're able to make connections in ways that may be more difficult with nation states because of politics and other baggage. Sorry, I hear the lawnmower guy outside my window right now. So just excuse me for a moment. C40 also formed a recovery task force to focus on sustainable and fair economic recovery post-pandemic. And this is really forward-looking, and I think, maybe one of the bright spots to come out of COVID is this opportunity for substantial changes that would have a positive impact on the environment and bridging the wealth gap. But this is really happening at the local level. It's not what's going on at the national level, and whether that's a function of what's going on in the Trump administration or just where city and state level power is going, I don't really know right now. So taking that, I'm going to talk about what all of these different manifestations mean or might mean, what they mean in the international system. So on the one hand, what's going on might challenge traditional ideas of nation states as sole rule makers and actors in global governance. But on the other hand, it's become a matter of necessity due to the inadequate multilateral and national responses. It's also a necessity because of underlying factors that may have not existed at the time that nation states were created. Issues like globalization and urbanization and the rise of nationalism. I think also, despite the success of Paris, which took a very long time to happen, collective action remains very difficult at the international level. Local officials, they're just able to get along better. They're pragmatic, and they want solutions. So it's easier for them to connect with counterparts around the world and come up with a solution. And I think given the political climate, it's refreshing to see, and it's proven, I think, to be effective on the ground. In terms of the system itself, subnational actors remain on the outside of global governance. They have no formal role at the negotiating table. Sometimes they're invited in an informal way. Sometimes they're left out altogether. They also, for international law people, don't have any legal personality. I don't see them getting any legal personality anytime soon. So they can't make binding international law, But as people who work in international law know, you know, soft international law is important too, and that's something that might be within their purview. Soft international law meaning that it's not really binding, but people are sort of doing it anyway. So this, I think, all leads to questions of whether these subnational actors should have an official place on the world stage, or if this ad hoc system of parallel networks and informality is sufficient. I think that whichever way the system evolves from here, nation states should find ways to complement and support the good work of local actors. Global problems like climate change and pandemics have localized impacts, making mayors, governors, and local actors uniquely situated to provide valuable insight both to their counterparts across the world, as well as to national governments and multilateral institutions. Ultimately, it's really the local politicians who are putting a lot of this action into play. So I think that subnational entities, I think that they're more than a safety net to the failures of multilateral systems and nation states. I think that they have a unique power that should be harnessed and complemented. And I'm not alone in thinking that. You'd be surprised that there's any bipartisan support for anything in Washington nowadays, but there was a bipartisan bill introduced to Congress called the City and State Diplomacy Act, which was going to set up an office for subnational diplomacy within the State Department. And this bill was introduced in the fall of 2019. It was supposed to be reported out of committee and recommended for further consideration, but that was in December of 2019. And so I think given impeachment and COVID, that this is something that is just going to sit around. And I think that's a shame, because I think having it formalized in that way would give a lot more opportunities for these subnational entities and boost their ability, especially the smaller subnational entities. New York City has no problem doing this, but other smaller cities might. So there's a couple of cities that already have international affairs offices, but you'll see that these are the larger cities: LA, Atlanta, New York City. I think there was some talk of some other cities forming these international affairs offices so they can liaise with foreign counterparts. And I think with that, I will yield to Carla and the audience for questions or discussion as you wish.
Thank you for that fascinating and stimulating talk of many, many questions. Let me just start with one. I mean, it seemed to me, even before the, as you indeed pointed out, even before the pandemic, that we saw a lot of action from cities on climate change in particular. And as I recall, the World Economic Forum had identified the issue of countries, nation states becoming increasingly unilateral and kind of transactional in their approaches to international policy, as creating a context in which all subnational governments, whether they are cities or provinces, states, et cetera, were going to probably play a more significant role in international affairs. But it's not universal. It's not that all of these subnational actors are are engaging internationally. In some cases, perhaps it is the size of the city that matters, or the size of the state. California, for example, is a huge global economy. But sometimes smaller cities are also engaged internationally. So to start, I'm going to start off with two questions and then open to the audience. But one of my questions is, what are the drivers? I mean, you said it's a necessity. Is it specific mayors who are really taking the lead here, or are there international, global, transnational groups that are providing the impetus for the kind of international leadership that some cities and also states are providing on global transnational threats and challenges?
Thank you, Carla. I think it's a combination of those. I think that that was a really well-worded question in describing what the situation is. There's been a couple of standout leaders, of course, in the context of climate change. The mayor of New York City, Bill de Blasio, the mayor of London. In fact, they had an article in The Guardian maybe a year or two ago, encouraging divestment in fossil fuels. And, it was like watching two world leaders. Since when do we need to know who the mayor is of all these different cities around the world? But they also belong to these robust networks that I think are also effective in pushing things forward. And obviously at the state or province level in the US, on the climate change context, there's Jerry Brown. We also have a former mayor who likes to meddle in a couple of things, and Michael Bloomberg has been incredibly committed to climate change action. And he's obviously had the role of former mayor of New York City, and so knows that system quite well. But he was also appointed to some UN posts related to climate change. And he also has his private philanthropies that work on things like climate change and city diplomacy. So he's really trying to harvest that power. So I do think it's a collection of all these different factors that are really driving it from the standpoint of who's involved. But obviously there's factors that are just pushing cities and states to get involved. I think the issue with COVID and PPE, they didn't see themselves as entities that should be negotiating for this PPE. I think they were all caught off guard by that fact, but they saw their states and cities in great need and did what they had to do. And now that they know how to do these things, maybe they'll be encouraged to do them in other contexts as well.
Well, speaking of those other contexts, one of the other questions I have, and one we discussed briefly, was whether there should be either global organizations helping to organize and channel the power of these cities in a way that amplifies their influence, or whether they should be officially incorporated into the multilateral system. And if so, if either way, I mean, what would it look like? So how would they be incorporated into existing multilateral system, or might these networks become more formalized and more significant in affecting global change, solving problems?
Thank you. So I think that since a lot of the multilateral institutions, we would say, are broken or bureaucratic and slow and controlled by nation states that are putting their national interests over the collective, that maybe formal roles in multilateral institutions will just slow down the work of cities and provincial areas. One thing that I think is interesting is that there's this organization of cities, I believe it's cities, called the U20, the Urban 20, yes, cities. And they mirror the G20 and they follow the G20. So they meet before the G20, and then they can vocalize their opinions and findings to the G20. So I think that's one way that they're trying to have influence in a collected way and an organized way, and maybe that is more efficient than being within the system that is already at a standstill. I don't really know for sure, because I think that there has to be some type of empirical study on what's really going on, but logically it makes sense to me.
Interesting. I'm looking for questions from our audience. So as you have one, I see we have one from Ben Scher. Excuse me if I mispronounced your name. If you just want to unmute and go ahead and just ask the question verbally, orally, that would be great.
Thanks, Carla, and thanks, Tiffany. My question was around, have you seen any pushback from any of this? I know coming from the UN side, some member states tend to guard their turf quite jealously. And so you might expect that some of them might not like cities going out on their own like this and stepping into international fora like this, which they see as the purview of member states. Similarly around the VLRs, the voluntary local reviews, you could foresee cities using them as an excuse to embarrass or kind of highlight the shortcomings of national governments. We see that around the VNRs where, the questions are all pre-cooked and all that kind of stuff to avoid anything embarrassing. So just wondering if you've seen any pushback to any of this.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks for joining us today. I think it's sort of interesting. I guess I'd be interested to look at the VLRs and compare them to the VNRs, because it sounds like what you're saying is that they could use them as shadow reports, which is something that happens in human rights systems where there's an official state report and then an NGO or collective of NGOs has the shadow report, this is more likely the situation on the ground than what the nation state's giving. So it'll be interesting to use that tool that way. I think in the US context, though, with the current administration, speaking out of order, something that the president's doing just gets you made fun of on Twitter, or he threatens to withhold federal funding to your state or threatens to close down your airport. So I think we're in very unusual times, but I also think that there's so much chaos within the current administration that maybe they're not noticing as much all these city and state acts and don't have responses for them. I know I've heard of instances where the State Department has pushed back. This was a while ago on, I think, treaties or agreements between like Canada I know I'm from New York, but I don't really know what Canadian province is directly above New York, but there was supposed to be an agreement between New York and the Canadian province above New York regarding land or water or some transboundary issue, and the State Department was pushing back on, who gets to control this type of agreement and issue. So, I mean, I think you would see some pushback from nation states if it embarrasses them, but maybe they see it as a convenience to have the cities and states do what they can't, because for political reasons they might not be able to have that connection with China or Russia, but the mayors could.
Thank you.
I think that's a great question, and I thought that was a really interesting answer as well. It occurs to me that, it raises some bigger questions. First of all, the extent to which the involvement of states and cities might actually pose a threat to a system like ours, a federal system. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that big question. And then a second question, sort of flipping it in a way, is, and going back, I think, to a dimension of Ben Scher's question is, does the rise of cities as diplomatic actors and also states and provinces, does that actually threaten the Westphalian system? Are we seeing the Westphalian system crumble? I'd love to hear, I'm sure you've thought about that. I'd love to have your thoughts. And then we'll get to Justin Frosene's question.
Oh, great. Wonderful. Okay. So I think the first question regarding issues of federalism in the US, it's an interesting question. Putting aside the issues of treaty making, which I think there's enough guidance on with the Constitution and the State Department. What we're really looking at with states kind of off doing their own thing is foreign affairs preemption. And there's some case law out there on it. And it looks like the question might be, well, why is the state or whoever, the local actors, why are they imposing this law? Are they imposing this law because they're active in usual state responsibility? I mean, because there's a lot of concurrent powers between the state and the federal government. So are they doing it because of that? Or are they doing it as a response to a foreign policy? So there's an example, I think, out of Hawaii, where after Trump said that they were going to withdraw from Paris, Hawaii said that they were going to legislate something as a response to that, rather than as, in their responsibility as a state to act on climate change. So if we, I think this case was in the Ninth Circuit, so I'm not sure if this test is actually going to apply in other places, but if that's the test, then politicians have to be really careful about their stated reasons for doing things. Otherwise, they risk federal preemption. Does the rise of cities threaten the Westphalian system? I mean, cities came first. New York City is about 100 years older than the United States itself. I think we've seen cities and states kind of flex their muscles with their economic power. There was, I think it was not serious talk, like if California secedes, and that's the third largest economy in the world, or one of the largest economies in the world. So I think that helps them, play the political game with the federal government, because they do have so much power. But it's, I think, in a non-serious way, they're not leaving the United States anytime soon, and nation states is still where all the power is. This is why so many groups fight for statehood, because that's where the power is. If cities were good enough, then we wouldn't see as much conflict as we have to have one's own state. So I think because of the way that the system's laid out currently, there is no real threat to the Westphalian system. And if there was a threat, it would evolve slowly. It's not like it's going to crumble tomorrow. And cities, they used to be the main players in foreign policy, and then the Westphalian system came and the power dynamic shift to nation states. And now maybe nation states just have to give a little bit away, and maybe that'll be the answer.
That's very interesting. Tiffany, let me now ask Justin Frosene. He's been patiently waiting to ask his question. If you want to just ask it out loud, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. First of all, hello, Tiffany, and greetings from Bologna. It's nice to see you, and it was a really, really interesting and fascinating talk. And of course, I agreed with what you said about the cities came first, because of course I come from Italy, which of course is a country that was, created through the cities, if you think about the Republic of Venice and so on and so forth. So mine was, I think, just a simple question, and making a comparison with the debate that's going on in Italy. As you know, we're not a federal system, but we are a strongly regionalized and decentralized system. And there is an interesting dynamic between the mayors of the big cities in Italy and what we call the presidents of the regions, although Italian journalists have started referring to them as governors, using the American term. So I was wondering what sort of dynamic there is between the mayors of the big cities, the governors, and the federal level, because Italy, the situation is rather complicated. Anyway, great to see you.
Yeah, thank you, Justin. And that's a really great question. And I think we're fortunate in that I've been spending the past couple of months in New York, where there are daily briefings or there used to be daily briefings. I think they've slowed them down because New York's doing a great job of controlling COVID. and there'd be briefings from the governor of New York, then there'd be briefings from the mayor of New York City, and then for a while Trump was doing briefings, but he was so bad at it that he had to cancel them. So, and sometimes you saw very publicly that there were disagreements about, I think the biggest disagreement, or one of the bigger disagreements in New York City, was about closing public schools, which eventually happened. Ultimately, I think the governor won out over the mayor on issues that they were conflicted about. And the tension with the federal level in the US, once again, because we have a juvenile president, I think manifests itself into these petty Twitter wars, you know, about the governor of New York, or threats that Trump can make against so-called blue states. So the biggest issue now, I think, from the federal government perspective, is that some of these states that have been hit hardest, they're waiting to see whether they're going to get any federal relief, because it looks like a lot of these states are going to have to substantially cut their budgets because so much went into COVID, and whether federal relief is coming or not hasn't been clear.
Well, anybody else have a question? Otherwise, I have another one, which I haven't formed terribly well, so bear with me. But one of the things that you said was sort of Trump, you referred to Trump's threats to blue states, but you know, when I'm a China scholar, so when Trump was elected, his campaign strategy was described by a lot of Chinese as very Maoist in nature. He sort of used the countryside to surround the cities, right, and used the voting power of the rural and suburban areas to trump urban votes in a way, and that we still have that tension. I mean, how there's an urban-rural kind of factor here, and I wondered if you thought about that. You know, as cities become have more of an international profile, is that going to how is that going to affect the domestic political dynamics of countries?
Yeah, I think it's a really fascinating question, but I think the problem is now we're just under so much change. There's talk now of people fleeing cities because they realize when there's a pandemic, they don't want to be in cities. But vice versa, what I think we're going to end up seeing is COVID's hitting the countryside now. And so the people that maybe before didn't see the utility in, you know, the mayors or, you know, governors getting involved in what they see as these international issues might see it a little bit differently. You know, going back to the tiny little example in Gilbert, Arizona, I'm not familiar with Arizona. I had to look up where Gilbert was, and you know, it's Arizona. And so that tiny little example of something that area desperately needed and getting it abroad might be enough to demonstrate that isolationism is just not, it's not going to work. You know, you look at the pandemic, it doesn't work. We needed help. Other countries need help. The states, they were trading supplies back and forth. Going it alone, it's not going to happen.
Hi, Carla.
Yes, hi, Dorothy.
Hi there. It's so nice to see you. And Tiffany, thank you so much for your comments. I live in New York too. And I was just wondering, you know, it was fascinating to hear your broader perspective, but I was transfixed by watching Cuomo every day. That was my one, I couldn't bear watching so much of the news, but Cuomo was really uplifting. He was factual, he was straightforward. I really think he saved us in New York. Yeah. And from a totally incompetent person in Washington. So here's the question I have. I mean, Cuomo kept talking about this governor's group that he was the vice chair of and Hogan of Maryland was the chair of. And it really sounded exciting that those guys were getting their act together and trying to coordinate some kind of a national response and national standards. And Cuomo took the initiative, appointed Bloomberg to head up a group to do contact and tracing. He got Eric Schmidt of Google to do what was he was going to do another major thing. And what's become of some of these initiatives? I mean, Cuomo was very enthusiastic. He said they're going to make their findings available to all the governors, to all states. And now what we see evolving right now is the states just falling apart, who haven't taken this whole issue seriously. So what about this organization? And is it just doomed because there's just too much factionalism and too much partisanship?
Thank you, Dorothy. You know, I hate the fact that facts are what's dooming us. So I'm familiar with the Governors Association and the fact that they've been on phone calls with each other, sharing experiences and practices. I'm also aware that there's been certain regions of the country where they've formed pacts because they realize that, you know, like the tri-state area in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, if they control it in one area, or if they open up too early in another area, if you open up the beach in New Jersey, people from New York are going to go to New Jersey to go to the beach. So they realized that they had to have some type of coordination, at least regionally. And that regional block, I know, expanded to Pennsylvania and elsewhere. And I think there was a similar regional block in the Pacific Northwest. And these are all in areas where things are more under control, especially in the Northeast. The Pacific Northwest has gotten out of control again, but I don't know what that is actually a function of. But then, of course, we have all these areas. And I am based out of New York, but I'm currently in Georgia, where I can tell you for a fact that people are not taking this seriously. You go outside and I'd say probably about 70% of people are not wearing masks, just going about their daily business. And, you know, I don't know if it's, you know, governors sort of falling in line with Trump and politicizing even the idea of a mask. You know, so many Republican politicians have just been afraid of Trump. And I don't know if Trump is losing his hold over people given the current polling, but I sure hope he is. And, you know, they've politicized, you know, something as simple and basic as public health. Contact tracing, I know there's been calls for contact tracers. I know Hopkins is offering a free contact tracing course for people interested in contact tracing. I'm not sure where it's taken off yet. I think places where, like New York City, you know, it's impossible at the scale we were to do contact tracing. But in smaller areas, contact tracing could help stop a little pocket of COVID from coming. So I think these are good initiatives, but I think you're also right that people do not want to accept reality. They want to go to the hairdresser and they want to go to the amusement park. And, you know, it's my 5 or almost 6-year-old daughter walked up to somebody in a store and asked her why she wasn't wearing a mask. And I had to explain that, you know, we were coming from New York where, you know, by law we have to wear masks. And the person was kind of shamed, but it was like a 5-year-old doing it, so it was okay. But that's the reality here. People are, and I think that's the reality in other places where it's growing, like in Arizona and Florida, places where there's a lot more vulnerable people because of demographics. So I don't know.
Sounds if you're raising a good kid.
Oh, oh yeah.
So I don't see any other questions right now, but let me ask another one. But I do. We're getting close to the hour, so I hope that anyone who does have a question does raise their hand. But just wondered if, and it may be too soon, obviously, because we've had the if the virus pandemic is a key case study. Obviously, that's still ongoing. But are you seeing signs that local governments, especially city governments, are starting to build out their offices or structures within institutions within the government that can help them address international global challenges through diplomacy?
So Ben might know more about this than I do, but what I can say that I have seen, are the calls to build up contact tracing and contact tracers. But the other problem, and I just saw a news article, I don't remember if it's New York City or New York State, but they're set to lay off or lose thousands of jobs because of this budgetary issue and lack of commitment from the federal government to the budget. So I think, some cities that want to build out can't build out until the budget's under control. So I think that might be a constraint. I think many cities and states have learned valuable lessons, learned that they can't rely on the federal government and this mysterious stockpile that doesn't exist or existed and disappeared. So I think they'd all be well-to-do to have pandemic responses in place and adequate gear. And I think that's going to be a priority for politicians moving forward. So
interesting. Yeah. Making sure no more questions. One other question that I think you and I had also touched on and it's a good place to end. So if anyone has a question, jump in now because we might end on this one. Maybe before I ask this question, let me just make sure that Ben Scher, since we have him here, he didn't want to comment on my previous question since Tiffany mentioned him. Do you have anything to add to that? We've got another expert here.
No. I think Tiffany's the real expert. She covered it, but thanks for the opportunity and for the shout out, Tiffany. Much appreciated.
Okay. Well, my other question, just to end with this one, is will a change in the U.S. administration either impede the progress of city diplomacy, or will it actually contribute new opportunities? And I guess we're speculating about the impact of a Biden administration versus another 4 years of Donald Trump.
I don't say those words out loud, but okay, 4 years of Donald Trump. Yeah, so I guess there's some hope with the Biden administration, considering he was part of an Obama administration that seemed to be interested in subnational diplomacy. So there's the hope for that. But, I know that Biden just can't, it's not going to work for him to just formulate to Obama because there's a lot of different pressures on him from different sides. So I don't know what his presidency would look like, but any presidency will look better than what we currently have. And whether another 4 years of Trump would be better or worse for city diplomacy and state diplomacy, I don't know, because Trump just keeps creating opportunities for states and cities to step in and do something rather than it being more organic. They're, crisis shootings. So, and now the kids are coming up and screaming. So it's good that we've ended, we've gotten close to the hour. But, I think it's all a wait and see. I think, Biden is reasonable, and I think would see the value in city and state diplomacy.
Well, this is fascinating, and I followed some of this as a China scholar, because even though China's a unitary state, it's such a huge country, and it's highly decentralized, and so a lot of when those of us who are pro-engagement people, or at least have been with China, focused heavily on the potential for localities to engage at the subnational level with U.S. states and cities, and that's something indeed on climate change that both Governor Brown and former Mayor Bloomberg have worked on very actively. So, it's certainly from the U.S.-China relationship perspective, that alone, it's a very, very interesting and dynamic set of relationships. and it's been wonderful for me to contextualize that more globally, and also to look at it from the perspective of the current crisis. And so thank you so much. And also thanks for the really wonderful questions from the audience. And I'm excited to see what you do next, Tiffany. So thank you so much.